July 14, 1943, Selfridge Field, Michigan. Under the sweltering summer heat, Technical Sergeant William Bill Jackson wiped streams of sweat from his forehead as he stared at the smoking engine of a P-47 Thunderbolt fighter that had nearly killed its pilot during a routine training exercise. The young mechanic believed he had found a simple solution to the chronic overheating problems plaguing America's most expensive fighter aircraft. What he couldn't possibly know was that his unorthodox idea would be ridiculed, rejected, and then desperately implemented across 2 theaters of war, ultimately saving hundreds of aircraft and the lives of the men who flew them. Before we dive into this story, drop a quick hi in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the untold story of how a segregated military reluctantly embraced the genius of one man, revealing how innovation can emerge from the most unexpected places, even as the machinery of war and prejudice ground on. The silver P-47 Thunderbolt fighter sat on the tarmac like a wounded beast, coolant fluid still dripping from its massive 18-cylinder Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine. Steam rose from the cowling as Technical Sergeant William Jackson approached. The 27-year-old mechanic from Detroit had been assigned to the 332nd Fighter Group's ground crew just 3 months earlier, but he'd already developed a reputation for diagnosing engine problems that baffled other mechanics. "How bad is it, Jackson?" Lieutenant Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, Jr. asked, his voice carrying the weight of command that had made him the respected leader of what would later become known as the Tuskegee Airmen. "Bad enough, sir," Jackson replied, running a hand over his close-cropped hair. "Third one this month. These engines are running too hot, especially during climb. If we don't solve this, we're going to lose pilots." Davis nodded gravely. At 41, he had already broken numerous barriers as one of the few black officers in the United States Army Air Forces. The son of the first black general in the U.S. Army, Davis carried himself with a dignified determination that commanded respect even in a military establishment resistant to black leadership. "What's your assessment?" Davis asked. Jackson gestured toward the engine. "The R2800 is a powerful engine, sir. 8,000 pounds of aircraft trying to climb on 1 horsepower generates extreme heat. The current cooling system just can't keep up, especially in these summer temperatures." A few feet away, Captain Harold Collins, a white technical advisor assigned to oversee maintenance operations for the 332nd, scoffed audibly. "The design comes straight from Republic Aviation, Jackson. Are you saying you know better than their engineers?" Jackson stood his ground. "With respect, sir, I worked at the Ford River Rouge plant before the war. I know engines, and I know this cooling system design has a fatal flaw." The exchange was interrupted by the approach of Lieutenant Richard Thorpe, the pilot who had barely managed to land the overheating P-47. His flight suit was soaked with sweat, his face still pale from the near-death experience. "Whatever you boys are arguing about, I hope it includes fixing these damn engines," Thorpe said. "Temperature gauge went into the red 2 minutes after takeoff. By the time I got to 12,000 feet, I had warning lights across the board. Another minute, and I would have been jumping out." Colonel Davis turned to Jackson. "You have an idea, Sergeant?" "Yes, sir, I do." "Then I want it on my desk tomorrow morning, with diagrams," Davis said firmly, silencing Captain Collins's attempted protest with a raised hand. "I'm not losing any more pilots to mechanical failures." As the officers walked away, Jackson knelt beside the engine, his mind already working through the calculations and modifications that would be required for his solution. He pulled a small notebook from his pocket and began sketching. What he didn't notice was Master Sergeant Frank Weaver watching him from the hangar doorway. Weaver, a 52-year-old white mechanic from Georgia with 20 years of military service, had initially resented being assigned to work with the all-black fighter group. But over the past few months, he had developed a grudging respect for Jackson's mechanical intuition. "You really think you can fix what Republic's engineers couldn't?" Weaver asked, approaching the younger man. Jackson looked up from his notebook. "I know I can, Sarge. I just need to convince everyone else." "Good luck with that," Weaver replied. "Military doesn't exactly welcome suggestions from—" He caught himself. "From mechanics?" Jackson completed the sentence with a knowing look. "Yeah." Weaver nodded. "From mechanics." Back in his quarters that night, Technical Sergeant William Jackson worked by the light of a single lamp, refining his design. Born in rural Mississippi in 1916, Jackson had displayed a talent for mechanical work from an early age, taking apart and reassembling farm equipment by the time he was 12. His family had moved to Detroit in 1932 as part of the Great Migration, and young William had eventually secured a coveted position at Ford's River Rouge complex, where he quickly distinguished himself as a problem solver. When America entered the war following the attack on Pearl Harbor, Jackson had volunteered for service, hoping his skills would be put to good use. Instead, like most black servicemen, he had initially been assigned to a segregated service unit, performing manual labor far from the technical work he was qualified to do. It had taken the advocacy of a former Ford supervisor, now an Army captain, to get Jackson reassigned to aircraft maintenance for the newly formed 332nd Fighter Group. Now, he was facing the greatest technical challenge of his career, and potentially the most significant opportunity to prove his worth. The P-47 Thunderbolt was America's premier fighter aircraft in 1943, a massive, powerful machine that could outfight and outmuscle almost anything in the sky. But its Achilles heel was becoming increasingly apparent. The cooling system simply couldn't handle the enormous heat generated by the R-2800 engine during high-performance maneuvers. Jackson's solution was both elegant and unorthodox. Instead of trying to improve the existing cooling system, which relied on air flowing through carefully designed ducts, he proposed adding a secondary cooling circuit that would pre-cool the engine oil using a modified intercooler design he had helped develop for Ford's aircraft engine division. His sketches showed how the system could be integrated with minimal modifications to the airframe, potentially solving the overheating problem without requiring a complete redesign. As he completed his proposal in the early hours of the morning, Jackson allowed himself a moment of cautious optimism. If his design worked, it would not only save aircraft and lives, but might also help demonstrate that the technical contributions of black servicemen could be just as valuable as those of their white counterparts. The following morning, Colonel Davis reviewed Jackson's proposal in his office, with Captain Collins and Major James Thompson, the group engineering officer, present. "This is unconventional," Thompson admitted as he studied the diagrams. "It's more than unconventional, it's amateur," Collins interjected. "With all due respect to Sergeant Jackson, this design violates basic principles of aircraft engineering. Adding weight to a fighter aircraft to solve a cooling problem is backwards thinking." Colonel Davis remained silent, continuing to examine the proposal. Finally, he looked up. "How much weight would this add, Sergeant Jackson?" "Approximately 18 pounds, sir," Jackson replied, "but it would remove the need for pilots to restrict their climb rate and throttle settings, which effectively reduces the aircraft's performance much more than 18 pounds of weight would." Davis nodded. "And how quickly could this be implemented?" "We could modify one aircraft within a week, sir. If it works, the rest of the squadron could be retrofitted within a month." Collins shook his head vigorously. "Colonel, I strongly advise against this. Republic Aviation has their best engineers working on this issue. Any unauthorized modifications could void the maintenance contracts and potentially endanger pilots. I'm more concerned about the pilots already being endangered by overheating engines," Davis countered. He turned to Major Thompson. "What's your assessment, Major?" Thompson hesitated, caught between engineering conservatism and practical necessity. "The design is unorthodox, as I said, but the underlying principles are sound. In theory, it could work." "Theory isn't enough," Collins pressed. "This needs proper testing facilities, wind tunnel analysis." "We don't have time for that," Davis interrupted. "Every day, our pilots are flying aircraft that could fail them at any moment." He made his decision. "Sergeant Jackson, you have permission to modify one P-47 according to your design. Major Thompson will oversee the work. We'll test it thoroughly before allowing it on a combat mission." "Sir, I must register my formal protest," Collins said stiffly. "Noted, Captain," Davis replied. "You can include it in your report to headquarters. In the meantime, we have work to do." As the officers filed out, Davis held Jackson back. "Sergeant, I'm taking a significant risk supporting this. not just with the aircraft, but with my own position. I need you to understand what's at stake." Jackson met his commander's gaze. "I understand completely, sir. I won't let you down." Over the next week, Jackson, assisted by Master Sergeant Weaver and a small team of mechanics, worked around the clock to implement his modified cooling system on a single P-47 Thunderbolt. The work was meticulous and challenging, requiring custom fabrication of several components and careful integration with the existing systems. "This better work, Jackson," Weaver muttered as they completed the final connections on the 7th day. "Otherwise, both our necks are on the line." "It'll work," Jackson replied with quiet confidence. "The principles are solid." The test flight was scheduled for the following morning, with Lieutenant Richard Thorpe, the same pilot who had experienced the near-catastrophic overheating incident, volunteering to fly the modified aircraft. As dawn broke over Selfridge Field, a small group gathered to witness the test. Colonel Davis and Major Thompson stood with Jackson and the mechanical team, while Captain Collins watched from a distance, his disapproval evident. Lieutenant Thorpe conducted his pre-flight checks with extra care, paying particular attention to the modified cooling system. Finally, he gave a thumbs up, sealed his canopy, and taxied to the runway. The P-47's massive engine roared to life, its distinctive sound echoing across the airfield as Thorpe pushed the throttle forward and began his takeoff roll. The heavily built fighter accelerated down the runway and lifted smoothly into the morning sky. Jackson watched intently as Thorpe put the aircraft through a series of increasingly demanding maneuvers, climbing rapidly to test the cooling system under maximum stress. After 30 minutes, significantly longer than previous flights had managed before encountering cooling problems, the P-47 returned to the field and landed smoothly. As Thorpe shut down the engine and climbed out of the cockpit, the gathered observers moved forward anxiously. "How did she perform, Lieutenant?" Colonel Davis asked. Thorpe removed his flight helmet, revealing a broad smile. "Like a dream, sir. Temperature gauge never went above normal, even during max climb and full military power. Whatever Sergeant Jackson did, it works." Major Thompson immediately moved to examine the engine, checking temperature readings and looking for any signs of stress or failure. After several minutes of inspection, he straightened up, an expression of surprised respect on his face. "The engine is running cooler than standard specifications," he announced, "even after a high-stress flight profile. I've never seen anything like it." Captain Collins pushed his way forward, incredulous. "That's impossible. Let me see those readings." As Collins reviewed the data, his face grew increasingly flushed. Finally, he looked up at Jackson, his expression a mixture of confusion and reluctant admiration. "How did you know this would work?" Jackson shrugged modestly. "It's just basic thermodynamics, sir. The R-2800 is a magnificent engine, but its cooling system was designed for different flight profiles than what we're asking of it now. My modification just bridges that gap." Colonel Davis allowed a rare smile to cross his face. "Well done, Sergeant Jackson. Major Thompson, begin implementing this modification across the squadron immediately." "Yes, sir," Thompson replied. "I'll draft a report for Technical Services Command as well. They may want to consider this for broader implementation." As the group dispersed, Master Sergeant Weaver approached Jackson with an outstretched hand. "I've been turning wrenches on aircraft for 20 years, and I've never seen anything like what you just pulled off. Good job, son." Jackson shook the older man's hand, feeling a moment of pride that transcended the normal boundaries of race and rank. "Thank you, Sarge, but the real test will come in combat." What none of them knew at that moment was how prophetic those words would prove to be. 3 months later, November 1943, Foggia Airfield Complex, Italy, Lieutenant Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, Jr. stood on the rain-soaked airfield, watching as the ground crew prepared the P-47 Thunderbolts of the 332nd Fighter Group for the next day's mission. The distinctive sound of the massive R-2800 engines being tested echoed across the field, as mechanics made final adjustments to the aircraft that had carried them across the Atlantic to this forward airbase in recently liberated southern Italy. Colonel Davis turned as a jeep splashed through puddles toward him, carrying Major General Nathan Twining, commander of the 15th Air Force. The general was not scheduled to visit their field, and Davis straightened his uniform, preparing for an unexpected inspection. "General Twining, sir." "We weren't expecting you," Davis said, saluting as the general stepped from the jeep. "At ease, Colonel," Twining replied, returning the salute before looking past Davis to the line of P-47s. "I came to see these modified aircraft of yours. The reports from your missions have caught some attention at headquarters." Davis nodded, understanding the subtext. After the successful testing at Selfridge Field, Jackson's cooling system modification had been implemented across the entire squadron before their deployment to Italy. In the 3 weeks they had been flying combat missions, not a single aircraft had been lost or forced to return early due to engine overheating, a record that stood in stark contrast to other P-47 units operating in the Mediterranean theater. "Would you like to see the modifications, sir?" Davis offered. "That's why I'm here," Twining confirmed, "and I want to meet this sergeant of yours who developed them." Davis led the general toward a maintenance hangar, where Technical Sergeant William Jackson was supervising the installation of his cooling system on a replacement P-47 that had just arrived from England. The aircraft had come with the standard configuration, and Jackson was ensuring it was modified to match the rest of the squadron before it entered combat. Inside the hangar, Jackson was so focused on the work that he didn't notice the officer's approach until Master Sergeant Weaver nudged him sharply. Jackson turned and snapped to attention when he saw the general's stars. "General, this is Technical Sergeant William Jackson," Davis introduced, "the man responsible for the cooling system modifications." Twining studied Jackson with interest. "I've read your technical report, Sergeant. Impressive work. Walk me through what you've done here." For the next 20 minutes, Jackson guided the general through a detailed explanation of his cooling system design, showing how it integrated with the P-47's existing systems and explaining the thermodynamic principles that made it effective. Despite his initial nervousness at briefing such a high-ranking officer, Jackson's confidence in his work showed through, and he answered Twining's technical questions with precision and clarity. "What gave you the idea for this approach?" Twining asked as the briefing concluded. "It came from my work at Ford before the war, sir," Jackson explained. "We were developing cooling systems for aircraft engines being built under government contract. The principles are similar, though I had to adapt them significantly for the P-47's specific requirements." Twining nodded thoughtfully. "Well, your adaptation may have solved a problem that's been plaguing our P-47 operations across multiple theaters. The 8th Air Force in England is reporting engine failure rates of nearly 12% on deep penetration missions, mostly due to overheating during combat or sustained high-altitude flight." The general turned to Colonel Davis. "I've discussed this with Technical Services Command. They want to implement Sergeant Jackson's modification across all P-47 units in the European and Mediterranean theaters." Davis couldn't hide his surprise. "That's excellent news, sir." "There's more," Twining continued. "They want Sergeant Jackson temporarily reassigned to Wright Field to work with Republic aviation engineers on standardizing the modification for production aircraft. He'd be there for approximately 1 month. Jackson stood straighter, struggling to contain his astonishment at this unexpected development. "When would this temporary duty begin, sir?" Davis asked, his tone carefully neutral. "Immediately," Twining replied. "There's a transport leaving for England tomorrow, connecting to a flight to the States. I've already cleared the orders." He turned to Jackson. "Pack your bags, Sergeant. You're going home for a while." After the general departed, Davis pulled Jackson aside. "This is a significant opportunity, Sergeant, not just for you, but for what it represents. Not many men in your position get this kind of recognition." Jackson nodded, understanding the unspoken message. As a black non-commissioned officer in a segregated military, being selected for such an assignment was virtually unprecedented. "I understand, sir. I won't let you down." "See that you don't," Davis replied. "A lot of eyes will be on you, some hoping you'll succeed, others." He left the sentence unfinished, but the meaning was clear. The following day, as Jackson prepared to board the C-47 transport that would begin his journey back to the United States, Master Sergeant Weaver approached him with an outstretched hand. "Don't let those pencil pushers at Wright Field take credit for your work, Jackson," Weaver advised, his gruff voice betraying genuine concern. "I've seen it happen before." Jackson smiled as he shook the older mechanic's hand. "I'll be careful, Sarge, but right now I'm more worried about those engineers accepting advice from someone like me." Weaver's expression turned serious. "You show them what you showed us here, that your ideas work better than theirs, and they'll listen. Engineers are funny that way. Results tend to speak louder than other considerations." With a final nod of thanks, Jackson boarded the aircraft, his mind already turning to the challenges ahead at Wright Field. As the C-47 lifted off from the muddy airstrip, he looked down at the row of P-47 Thunderbolts lined up for the day's mission, each one now carrying his modification. Whatever reception awaited him in Ohio, he had already proven what he was capable of where it mattered most, in the field, where lives depended on the reliability of the machines he serviced. December 11, 1943. Wright Field, Dayton, Ohio. The cavernous hangar at Wright Field's engineering division housed several partially disassembled P-47 Thunderbolts, each surrounded by white-coated engineers and technicians, making careful measurements and annotations. At a drafting table near the center of the activity, Technical Sergeant William Jackson sat with Dr. Anson Phillips, Republic Aviation's chief thermal engineer, reviewing the detailed diagrams of Jackson's cooling system modification. "The elegance is in its simplicity," Phillips admitted, tracing a finger along the routing of the secondary cooling circuit. "We'd been approaching the problem from the wrong angle entirely, trying to increase the efficiency of the main cooling system rather than creating a supplementary circuit to handle peak loads." Jackson nodded, relieved that the engineer, initially dismissive of a field modification designed by a sergeant, had come to appreciate the fundamental soundness of his approach. The past 2 weeks had been a constant battle for credibility, with each technical meeting requiring Jackson to prove and reprove his understanding of thermodynamics and engine cooling principles. "The weight penalty is the main concern for production implementation," Phillips continued. 18 pounds might not sound like much, but when you're calculating combat radius and performance, every pound matters. "I've been working on that," Jackson replied, pulling out a newer set of sketches from his folder. "Using aluminum for these components, instead of the steel we had available in the field, would reduce the weight to approximately 11 pounds, and I believe we could integrate it more efficiently into the production line assembly, eliminating these adapter fittings we had to use in our field modification." Phillips studied the new designs with growing interest. "This is good work, Jackson. Really good work. With these refinements, I think we have something that could be implemented across the production line without significant disruption." Their discussion was interrupted by the approach of Colonel Lawrence Browning, the Technical Services Command Officer overseeing the project. "Gentlemen, how are we progressing?" Browning asked, his tone brisk. Phillips straightened up. "Very well, Colonel. Sergeant Jackson's design principles are sound, and with some refinements for production engineering, I believe we can begin implementation within weeks rather than months." Browning nodded, but his expression remained reserved. "That's good to hear. We're receiving increasingly urgent requests from both theaters for a solution to the P-47 cooling issues." He turned to Jackson. "Sergeant, there's a Major Whitley from Public Relations who would like to speak with you. He's waiting in my office." Jackson exchanged a surprised glance with Phillips before following the colonel from the hangar. As they walked across the base, Browning maintained a professional silence until they were approaching headquarters. "Sergeant, before we meet with Major Whitley, there's something you should understand," Browning said, stopping abruptly. "Your cooling system design has attracted attention beyond technical services. The War Department sees potential, promotional value in your contribution." Jackson frowned slightly. "Promotional value, sir?" "Yes, Major Whitley will explain the details, but essentially they're interested in featuring your work in Army publications and possibly broader press releases. It would be presented as an example of Negro contributions to the war effort." Jackson absorbed this information in silence, understanding the complex implications. On one hand, such recognition could be a step forward in demonstrating the technical capabilities of black servicemen. On the other, being used as a propaganda example carried its own set of complications. "I see, sir," he finally responded. "And what is your recommendation?" Browning's expression softened slightly. "Off the record, Sergeant. I recommend you focus on getting your cooling system into production. That's the contribution that will save lives. The publicity is political, and politics in the military is rarely straightforward." Jackson nodded his appreciation for the candid advice as they continued to the colonel's office. Major Whitley, a polished officer with the smooth delivery of a former newsman, outlined an ambitious public relations campaign centered around Jackson's innovation. There would be photographs, interviews, and a feature in Stars and Stripes highlighting how a black mechanic had solved a problem that had stumped Republic Aviation's engineering team. "The Secretary of War himself has taken an interest in this story, Sergeant," Whitley explained enthusiastically. "It could be quite significant for morale, particularly among Negro troops and defense industry workers." Jackson listened politely, but his mind was on the production engineering still to be completed. "Sir, I appreciate the interest, but I'm concerned about taking time away from the technical work. The modification still needs refinement before it can be fully implemented." Whitley waved this concern aside. "The publicity aspects won't interfere with your technical duties, Sergeant. We'll work around your schedule. Colonel Browning has assured me that the engineering team can spare you for a few hours here and there." Browning's expression suggested no such assurance had been given, but he remained silent. "When would this begin, sir?" Jackson asked. "Immediately," Whitley replied. "In fact, I have a photographer waiting to take some shots of you working on the modifications. Just some posed images for now, nothing that would interrupt the actual work." Jackson looked to Colonel Browning, who gave a slight nod, indicating that he had little choice in the matter. "Very well, sir. I'm at your disposal." Over the next week, Jackson divided his time between the essential engineering work with Phillips and the increasingly intrusive publicity requirements orchestrated by Major Whitley. Photographs were taken, interviews conducted, and Jackson found himself carefully navigating questions that often seemed designed to elicit comments about racial integration rather than engine cooling systems. On December 18th, as Jackson was reviewing final production specifications with Phillips, a staff sergeant delivered a message requesting Jackson's immediate presence in Colonel Browning's office. When he arrived, he found Browning looking uncharacteristically uncomfortable, with Major Whitley and two unfamiliar officers present. "Ah, Sergeant Jackson," Whitley greeted him with forced brightness. "Allow me to introduce Colonel Hamilton and Major Pierce from the War Department Public Relations Bureau." Jackson saluted the officers, noting their stiff postures and the tension in the room. "Sergeant," Colonel Hamilton began without preamble, "we've reviewed the material prepared for release regarding your cooling system modification, and we've decided to take a different approach with the publicity." Jackson waited, sensing that whatever was coming wouldn't be to his liking. "The feature will now focus on the collaborative effort between field mechanics and Republic Aviation engineers, highlighting the Army Air Force's commitment to technical excellence," Hamilton continued. "Your contribution will be noted, of course, but within the context of the broader team effort." Whitley jumped in, his expression apologetic. "What Colonel Hamilton means, Sergeant, is that we'll be emphasizing how your initial field modifications provided valuable data that Republic's engineers then refined and perfected for production implementation." The implication was clear. Jackson's role was being diminished, his innovation reframed as merely inspirational rather than foundational to the final design. "I understand, sir," Jackson replied, keeping his voice neutral despite the burning sense of injustice rising within him. Colonel Browning, who had remained silent until now, cleared his throat. "There's another matter to discuss." Technical Sergeant Jackson's temporary assignment at Wright Field was scheduled to conclude next week. However, given the progress made on the production specifications, I believe his presence is no longer required. I'm recommending his immediate return to his unit in the Mediterranean theater. Major Whitley looked startled by this announcement, but Colonel Hamilton nodded approvingly. "That seems appropriate, Colonel Browning. The sergeant's unit could certainly use his technical expertise in the field." After the meeting concluded, Browning asked Jackson to remain behind. Once they were alone, the colonel's official manner relaxed slightly. "I apologize for how this has played out, Sergeant," Browning said quietly. The politics became complicated when the story reached certain levels at the War Department. Jackson nodded. I understand, sir. I'm a mechanic, not a politician. For what it's worth, your design is being implemented essentially unchanged. Phillips insisted on that. The production modifications are minor, just adaptations for manufacturing efficiency. That's what matters, sir, Jackson replied. That the aircraft get the cooling systems they need. Browning studied him for a moment. You're taking this better than many men would, Sergeant. Jackson met his gaze steadily. With respect, sir, this isn't the first time I've done the work and watched someone else take the credit. I didn't come to Wright Field for recognition. I came to make sure the modification was implemented correctly, so our pilots have reliable aircraft. The colonel extended his hand. The Army Air Forces is fortunate to have men like you, Jackson. Whatever the official story becomes, those of us who worked with you will know the truth. 2 days later, Technical Sergeant William Jackson boarded a transport aircraft bound for England, from where he would return to his unit in Italy. As the C-54 lifted off from Wright Field, he thought about the bizarre turn of events that had taken him from a segregated maintenance unit to the heart of the Army Air Force's engineering establishment and back again in the span of just 1 month. What he couldn't know, was that his return to the front lines would coincide with one of the most demanding periods of the air war, when his cooling system modification would face its ultimate test. January 30th, 1944. Foggia Airfield Complex, Italy. The dawn briefing room was filled with pilots of the 392nd Fighter Group, their faces illuminated by the harsh overhead lights as they studied the mission maps and target photographs. Colonel Davis stood at the front, outlining the day's assignment with characteristic precision. Gentlemen, today we'll be escorting B-17s of the 97th Bomb Group on a strike against aircraft manufacturing facilities near Regensburg, Germany. This is a maximum effort mission and our deepest penetration yet. Total mission time will exceed 7 hours, with significant time at high altitude in sub-zero temperatures. A murmur ran through the assembled pilots. 7-hour missions pushed the P-47's range to its absolute limits, even with drop tanks. And winter operations over the Alps meant dealing with extreme cold, high winds and unpredictable weather. Intelligence reports heavy fighter opposition, Davis continued. The Luftwaffe has been concentrating resources to defend the Reich's industrial centers. Expect Me-109s and FW-190s in significant numbers. Your primary objective remains the protection of the bomber force. Questions? Lieutenant Richard Thorpe raised his hand. Sir, what's the status of the cooling system modifications for this mission? 7 hours at military power is going to put tremendous strain on the engines. Davis nodded to Technical Sergeant Jackson, who had returned from his temporary duty at Wright Field just 3 days earlier. Sergeant Jackson will brief you on the technical preparations. Jackson moved to the front of the room, aware of the pilot's keen interest. These men trusted their lives to the aircraft his team maintained, and today's mission would push those machines to their limits. All aircraft assigned to today's mission have been fitted with the enhanced cooling system, Jackson assured them. We've also implemented some additional weatherproofing for the extreme cold you'll encounter at altitude. The system has been tested extensively in similar conditions and performed without issue. What Jackson didn't mention was the round-the-clock effort his maintenance team had put in over the past 72 hours to ensure every aircraft was properly prepared. The extreme conditions expected during the mission had required additional modifications to the oil lines to prevent freezing at high altitude, a problem they hadn't encountered in previous operations. One thing to note, Jackson added, you may observe slightly higher than normal oil pressure during initial climb. This is expected behavior with the cold weather modifications and not cause for concern. The pressure should stabilize once you reach cruising altitude. As the briefing concluded and the pilots departed to prepare for the mission, Master Sergeant Weaver approached Jackson with a concerned expression. Those cold weather mods you added, they haven't been field tested, Weaver noted quietly. Are you sure about this? Jackson nodded, though his expression betrayed a hint of the anxiety he felt. The principles are sound. The antifreeze additives and line insulation should prevent any congealing in the secondary circuit. But you're right. It's the first time we're flying with this configuration. Weaver clapped a hand on Jackson's shoulder. Well, if anyone can make it work, it's you. Come on, let's do one more check before they start engines. The pre-dawn darkness was broken only by the dim blue lights outlining the taxiways as the ground crews made final preparations for the mission. Jackson moved from aircraft to aircraft, performing personal inspections of the cooling system modifications, making minute adjustments, and reassuring pilots with his confident presence. At 5:45 hours, the first P-47 thundered to life, its massive engine shattering the morning quiet. One by one, the others followed suit until the entire flight line vibrated with the combined power of 24 200 horsepower radial engines. Jackson stood back, watching as the fighters taxied away, their navigation lights glowing like fireflies in the darkness. Colonel Davis, prepared to lead the mission personally, paused his aircraft near where Jackson stood and opened his canopy. "If your modifications work as well today as they have before, Sergeant," Davis called over the engine noise, "I'll recommend you for the Bronze Star when we return." Jackson saluted sharply. "Just come back safely, sir. That's all the recognition I need." Davis returned the salute, closed his canopy, and taxied to join the formation. Minutes later, the fighters began their takeoff rolls, lifting into the cold morning air in pairs and forming up for the long journey north. Left behind on the ground, Jackson and his maintenance team could only wait and wonder how their aircraft would perform in the extreme conditions ahead. Aboard the lead P-47, Colonel Davis climbed steadily through 10,000 feet, leading his formation toward the rendezvous point with the B-17 bombers they would escort. Outside his cockpit, the winter sky was transitioning from black to deep purple as dawn approached. Inside, despite his heavy flight gear, the cold was already seeping into his bones. Davis checked his engine gauges carefully, paying particular attention to the oil temperature and pressure indicators that would give the first warning of any cooling system issues. So far, everything was performing exactly as Jackson had predicted. The oil pressure had indeed risen during the initial climb, but was now stabilizing at the expected level. At 12,000 feet, they broke through a layer of stratus clouds into a world of dazzling clarity. Ahead, Davis could see the contrails of the bomber formation they were assigned to protect, 16 B-17 flying fortresses of the 97th Bomb Group, already assembling into their combat box formation. "Red leader to all red flights," Davis transmitted. "Bombers at 12 o'clock, Angels 18. We'll join up in escort position, flights in trail. Acknowledge." As the confirmations came in, Davis led his fighters in a sweeping arc that would bring them into position alongside and slightly above the bomber formation. The rendezvous was executed with precision, the P-47s taking up their protective stations around the more vulnerable B-17s. From the cockpit of the lead bomber, Colonel Walter Jenkins watched the fighters arrive with visible relief. "Red Leader, this is Fortress Lead. Good to see you, gentlemen. We've got a long ride ahead." "Fortress Lead, Red Leader," Davis responded. "We'll stay with you all the way to the target and back. Good hunting today." The combined formation turned northeast, climbing to 25,000 feet as they crossed the Adriatic and entered enemy-controlled airspace over Yugoslavia. The temperature outside the aircraft plunged to minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit, testing both men and machines to their limits. In his P-47, Lieutenant Richard Thorpe began to notice a disturbing trend on his engine instruments. Despite Jackson's cooling system modifications, his oil temperature was gradually rising as they flew deeper into hostile territory. It hadn't reached critical levels yet, but the steady climb was concerning. "Red 3 to Red Leader," Thorpe radioed to Davis. "I'm showing increasing oil temps. Not critical yet, but definitely trending upward." "Understood, Red 3, Davis replied. "Status of your other engine instruments?" "All normal. Just the oil temp that's concerning me." Davis quickly checked with the other pilots in the formation. 2 more reported similar symptoms, while the rest indicated normal operations. The common factor appeared to be aircraft that had received the most recent cold weather modifications to their cooling systems. Davis weighed his options. They were already deep in enemy territory, committed to the mission. Turning back the affected aircraft would leave them vulnerable to fighter attack without the protection of the formation. Continuing meant risking potential engine failures if the temperature issue worsened. All aircraft showing elevated temps, reduce power 5% and drop back slightly in formation, Davis ordered. Monitor your gauges continuously and report any further increases immediately. The modified power settings seemed to stabilize the temperatures, though at the cost of reduced performance for the affected aircraft. Davis made a mental note to discuss the issue with Jackson upon their return, assuming, of course, they all made it back. That assumption was challenged just 20 minutes later, as the formation approached the Austrian border. Ahead, the sky was suddenly filled with tiny black specks that rapidly grew into the distinctive silhouettes of German fighters, at least 30 Messerschmitt Bf-109s diving from above and behind the bomber formation. "Red leader to all red flights, bandits, high and behind, move to intercept," Davis ordered, pushing his throttle forward and pulling his P-47 into a climbing turn to meet the threat. The American fighters broke formation, accelerating to full military power as they moved to engage the attacking German aircraft. For Lieutenant Thorpe and the others who had been nursing their engines at reduced power, this meant immediately subjecting their potentially compromised cooling systems to maximum stress. What followed was 20 minutes of swirling, chaotic combat as the P-47s fought to keep the Messerschmitts away from the vulnerable bombers. The Thunderbolt's 850 caliber machine guns proved devastating when they found their mark, but the more nimble German fighters had the advantage in maneuverability. In the midst of the engagement, Thorpe found himself locked in a turning duel with a Bf-109, each pilot trying to get behind the other for a killing shot. The German pilot was skilled, forcing Thorpe to push his P-47 to its performance limits, the massive engine screaming at full military power as he hauled the fighter through tight turns and climbing spirals. Inside his cockpit, warning lights began to illuminate as his engine temperature climbed into the danger zone. Thorpe had a split-second decision to make: break off the engagement to save his engine, potentially leaving a section of the bomber formation vulnerable, or continue fighting and risk catastrophic engine failure. He chose to fight. Pulling his P-47 into a tight turn that strained both the airframe and the pilot, Thorpe managed to slip behind the Bf-109 just long enough to trigger a burst from his machine guns. The German fighter shuddered as the heavy bullets tore into its fuselage, then rolled over and dove away trailing smoke. But the victory came at a cost. Thorpe's engine temperature was now well into the red zone, and warning lights were flashing across his instrument panel. He throttled back immediately, but the damage might already be done. "Red 3 to Red Leader," Thorpe radioed, his voice tense. "Engine critical, I need to reduce altitude and power immediately." "Understood, Red 3, Davis responded. "Red 6 and 7, escort Red 3 down to safer altitude and provide cover." As the three P-47s descended from the main formation, Thorpe watched his temperature gauge anxiously. The reading was still dangerously high, but no longer increasing. Jackson's cooling system, despite being stressed beyond its design limits, was preventing a complete failure. At 15,000 feet, with reduced power settings, the temperature finally began to decrease towards safer levels. Thorpe breathed a sigh of relief, realizing how close he had come to losing his aircraft. "Red 3 to escorts, temperature stabilizing. I think we're okay to maintain this altitude and head for home." Similar scenarios played out across the formation as the air battle continued. The P-47s, despite their cooling system challenges, managed to drive off the German interceptors, allowing the bomber formation to continue toward its target. 2 Thunderbolts were lost to enemy fire, and 3 more, including Thorpe's, were forced to withdraw early due to engine issues. But the remaining fighters pressed on, determined to complete their escort mission. By the time the bombers reached Regensburg, only 15 P-47s of the original 24 remained with the formation. But they had successfully protected the B-17s, which were able to deliver their bomb loads on target with minimal losses. The return journey was a grueling test of endurance. With fuel supplies dwindling and several aircraft operating with compromised engines, Colonel Davis had to carefully manage his formation's resources. They descended to lower altitudes, where the air was warmer, reducing the strain on the cooling systems, and maintained conservative power settings whenever possible. As they crossed back into friendly airspace over Yugoslavia, Davis allowed himself to believe they might all make it home. That hope was shattered when Lieutenant James Wilson's P-47 suddenly emitted a plume of black smoke and began to lose altitude rapidly. "Red 12 is hit," called one of the pilots. "Going down fast." But there had been no enemy aircraft in the vicinity, no ground fire reported. Wilson's engine had simply failed, the cooling system finally giving way after hours of operation under combat stress. "I'm bailing out," Wilson transmitted calmly. "Engine seized completely, no chance of restart." Davis watched helplessly as Wilson's P-47 descended in an increasingly steep dive until the tiny figure of the pilot separated from the aircraft, his parachute blooming white against the dark landscape below. There was nothing they could do but mark his position for potential rescue efforts and continue their journey home. It was nearly dusk when the surviving P-47s of the 382nd Fighter Group returned to Foggia. Of the 24 aircraft that had departed that morning, 19 returned. 2 lost to enemy action, 1 to catastrophic engine failure, and 2 more forced to land at friendly fields in Yugoslavia when their fuel ran critically low. As the weary pilots shut down their engines and climbed from their cockpits, Technical Sergeant William Jackson moved among the aircraft, making initial assessments of the engines that had been pushed to their limits and beyond during the mission. Colonel Davis approached him as he examined Lieutenant Thorpe's P-47, which showed clear signs of extreme heat stress around the engine cowling. "Your cooling system saved a lot of aircraft today, Sergeant," Davis said, his voice hoarse with fatigue. "But we still had failures." Jackson nodded grimly as he inspected the discolored metal. "The cold weather modifications weren't adequate for the conditions you encountered, sir. I take full responsibility." Davis shook his head. "You had 3 days to prepare for a mission that pushed these aircraft beyond anything they've faced before. The fact that 19 out of 24 came back is nothing short of remarkable." "But not good enough," Jackson replied quietly. "Lieutenant Wilson might not make it home because my system failed. His aircraft was one of the oldest in the squadron," Davis pointed out, "and you warned us about the limitations of the modifications. This isn't on you, Sergeant." Jackson straightened up from his inspection. "With your permission, sir, I'd like to work through the night to modify the remaining aircraft with an enhanced version of the cold weather system. I have some ideas that should prevent a recurrence of today's problems." Davis studied the exhausted mechanic for a moment. "You haven't slept in, 36 hours? I'll sleep when the aircraft are ready, sir." Davis recognized the determination in Jackson's eyes, the same determination he had seen in his pilots before difficult missions. "Very well, Sergeant, but I want Master Sergeant Weaver to review your designs before implementation, and I want you to get at least 4 hours of rest before you start work." "Yes, sir," Jackson agreed reluctantly. As Davis walked away, Jackson turned back to the aircraft, already mentally redesigning the components that had failed under the extreme conditions of the day's mission. The cooling system had proven its value, but it wasn't perfect yet, and in war, imperfection cost lives. Over the next 3 days, Jackson led a round-the-clock effort to enhance the cold weather capabilities of the cooling system modification. Drawing on the lessons learned from the Regensburg mission, he redesigned the insulation for the oil lines, added heat exchange baffles to prevent freezing in the secondary circuit, and implemented a pilot-controlled bypass system that could direct additional heat to the oil reservoir during extremely cold conditions. Word of the 322nd's experience spread quickly through the 15th Air Force, with other P-47 units experiencing similar issues during winter operations. By early February, technical representatives from Republic Aviation had arrived at Foggia to study Jackson's enhanced modifications. This time, there was no attempt to minimize his contribution or reframe it as merely inspirational. The combat results spoke for themselves. On February 15th, a technical bulletin was issued to all P-47 units in the European and Mediterranean theaters, outlining the Jackson modification system for cold weather operations. The bulletin explicitly credited Technical Sergeant William Jackson of the 322nd Fighter Group as the primary developer of both the original cooling system enhancement and the cold weather adaptations. For Jackson, however, the most meaningful recognition came not from official publications, but from the pilots whose lives depended on his work. As February progressed into March and the 322nd transitioned from P-47 Thunderbolts To the longer-ranged P-51 Mustangs, not a single aircraft was lost due to engine cooling failures, even as mission durations and operational demands continued to increase. Lieutenant Richard Thorpe, who had come closest to losing his aircraft during the Regensburg mission, made a point of seeking out Jackson after returning from a particularly demanding escort mission to Berlin in early March. "I just wanted you to know, Sergeant," Thorpe said, "that your cooling system saved my life again today. We hit unexpected jet stream winds over Germany that pushed the engines well beyond normal operating parameters. Every gauge in my cockpit was redlined, but that bypass system you installed kept everything running." Jackson, who had been preparing to apply his cooling system expertise to the squadron's new P-51s, nodded appreciatively. "Glad to hear it worked as designed, Lieutenant." Thorpe shook his head with a hint of amazement. "You know, when you first proposed that cooling system back at Selfridge Field, I thought it was just another mechanic's field fix, something that might work for a while but wouldn't hold up under real combat conditions. I've never been so happy to be wrong in my life." The transition to P-51 Mustangs in March 1944 marked a new chapter for both the 382nd Fighter Group and Technical Sergeant William Jackson. The Mustang, with its Packard-built Merlin engine, had different cooling challenges than the P-47's massive radial engine, but the principles Jackson had pioneered, the creation of supplementary cooling circuits to handle peak loads, the emphasis on adaptable systems that pilots could control based on conditions, and the meticulous attention to thermal dynamics under various operational scenarios proved just as valuable with the new aircraft. By April 1944, as the air war over Europe intensified with the approach of the Allied invasion of France, the 302nd Fighter Group had established a remarkable record of reliability. While other units continued to lose aircraft to mechanical failures, the Red Tails, as they were becoming known due to the distinctive red paint applied to their aircraft tails, demonstrated consistently higher mission completion rates and lower mechanical abort rates than almost any other fighter group in the theater. This reliability translated directly into combat effectiveness. With confidence in their aircraft, the pilots of the 382nd could focus fully on their primary mission of bomber protection, developing tactics and techniques that would eventually result in one of the most impressive escort records of any fighter group in the war. For Technical Sergeant William Jackson, the war continued as it had begun, in the shadow of the aircraft he maintained, away from the spotlight of public recognition, but secure in the knowledge that his contribution was saving lives and helping to win the war. The technical bulletin bearing his name became standard reference material for P-47 maintenance crews across multiple theaters, and his cooling system design was incorporated into late production aircraft at the Republic Aviation Factory. The full impact of Jackson's innovation would not become clear until after the war, when statistical analysis revealed that his cooling system modification had reduced engine-related losses in P-47 units by approximately 38% during the critical period from January to May 1944, representing hundreds of aircraft and pilots saved. Yet perhaps the most significant legacy of Jackson's work was less tangible but equally profound. In a military still rigidly segregated by race, where black servicemen were routinely assigned to support roles and denied opportunities to fully utilize their skills and education, Jackson's success demonstrated what could be achieved when talent was recognized and utilized regardless of race. After the war, William Jackson returned to Detroit, using the technical knowledge and leadership experience gained during his military service to build a successful career in the automotive industry. He would later be instrumental in mentoring young black engineers and technicians entering the field, creating opportunities that had been denied to him in his youth. The cooling system he designed under the pressures of wartime necessity would influence aircraft engine design for decades to come, with variations of his approach appearing in both military and civilian aircraft through the 1950s and beyond. Technical publications would occasionally reference the Jackson system without elaboration. Most readers unaware of the remarkable story behind the name, the story of a segregated mechanic whose innovative thinking saved hundreds of aircraft when they were most desperately needed. August 1985. Tuskegee Airmen Reunion, Detroit, Michigan. The banquet hall was filled with aging veterans, many wearing distinctive red blazers that identified them as members of the Tuskegee Airmen, the black pilots and support personnel who had served with the 322nd Fighter Group and related units during World War II. At a table near the front sat William Jackson, now 69 years old, his hair grey but his posture still military straight. Beside him was Richard Thorpe, the pilot whose life had been saved multiple times by Jackson's cooling system. At the podium, retired General Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., the former commander of the 322nd, who had gone on to become the first black general in the United States Air Force, was concluding his remarks about the legacy of the Tuskegee Airmen. "Before I finish tonight," Davis said, "I want to recognize someone whose contribution to our success has never received the public attention it deserves." He gestured toward Jackson's table. William Jackson's cooling system modification saved more aircraft and more pilots than any other single technical innovation in our group. His work exemplified the excellence that all of you brought to your duties, whether in the cockpit or on the ground. The assembled veterans rose in a standing ovation, many of the pilots in the room personally aware of how Jackson's innovation had affected their own chances of survival during the war. As the applause continued, Thorpe leaned over to Jackson. "You know what I remember most about your cooling system?" he asked. Jackson raised an eyebrow questioningly. "It wasn't just that it worked," Thorpe explained. "It was knowing that someone on the ground cared that much about getting the details right. Someone who understood that a few degrees of engine temperature could mean the difference between coming home and not coming home. That knowledge gave us confidence every time we took off." Jackson nodded, understanding precisely what Thorpe meant. In war, as in life, it was often the unseen contributions, the meticulous attention to detail by those whose names rarely appeared in headlines, that made the difference between success and failure, between life and death. As the reunion continued around them, with old comrades sharing memories both painful and triumphant, Jackson reflected on the strange journey that had taken him from a segregated maintenance hangar to the heart of one of the most significant technological challenges of the air war. His cooling system design had indeed been crazy by the conventional engineering standards of the time, unorthodox in approach, developed without the resources of a major research facility, created by a man who wasn't supposed to have the knowledge to solve such a complex problem. Yet it had worked, and in war, results mattered more than conventional wisdom, more than prejudice, more than the artificial barriers that society constructed between human beings. If there was a lesson in his experience, a lesson that extended beyond the technical details of engine cooling systems to the broader questions of human potential and opportunity, it was perhaps this: innovation knows no color line. Talent respects no artificial boundaries, and excellence is possible from any quarter when necessity drives invention and determination overcomes doubt. It was a lesson that America was still learning, even 4 decades after the war. But as Jackson looked around the room at the men who had once been dismissed as incapable of flying combat aircraft, yet had proven themselves among the most effective escort pilots of the war, he knew that progress, however slow, was still progress. And sometimes it began with something as seemingly mundane as a better way to cool an overheating engine. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.